I drove my son and his fiancée to the airport the morning after Christmas, and I still remember the exact moment everything changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a text message glowing on a phone that slipped between the seats and 3 words that made my stomach drop. "Why aren't you answering?" He was sitting right next to her. Let me back up. My name is June and I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a middle school librarian in Dayton, Ohio, and I have been widowed for 8 years. My husband, Ted, died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning while I was at work. He was 57. You never fully recover from something like that. You just learn to carry it differently. After Ted died, my son became the center of my world in a way that probably wasn't healthy for either of us. I know that now. I didn't know it then. My son's name is Connor. He's 34, tall like his father, with Ted's same dark eyes and that same stubborn jaw. He works in logistics management for a distribution company in Columbus, about an hour and a half from me. We talk on the phone every Sunday. We have since Ted passed. It was Connor's idea, actually. He called me the Sunday after the funeral and just said, "I'll call every week, Mom, I promise." And he has. Not once missed it in 8 years. So when Connor called me in September and said he had someone he wanted me to meet, I cried a little after I hung up. Happy tears. The kind you cry when you've been quietly worried about your child for years and something finally shifts. Her name was Paige. He brought her to Dayton for Thanksgiving. I spent 3 days cleaning the house, made the green bean casserole from scratch, ordered a fresh pie from the bakery on 5th because mine always comes out a little dense. I wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted her to feel welcome. I wanted Connor to see that I was happy for him. Paige was lovely. That's the word I keep coming back to, lovely. Soft-spoken, polite, the kind of young woman who offers to help clear the table without being asked. She was 31, worked as a dental hygienist, had grown up in a small town outside of Cincinnati. She laughed easily and genuinely, the kind of laugh that crinkles the eyes. She asked me about Ted. She asked to see photos. When I showed her the one from our trip to Yellowstone in 1998, Ted in that ridiculous fishing hat, she said, "He looks like someone who told great dad jokes," and I laughed so hard I had to sit down. I liked her immediately, more than liked her. I felt, for the first time in a long time, that my son was going to be okay. Thanksgiving was warm and easy, and I went to bed that night genuinely grateful. Christmas came 2 months later. Connor and Paige drove up together on the 23rd and planned to fly out of Dayton Airport on the 26th. They were heading to Paige's family in Cincinnati for a few days before New Year's. I offered to drive them. It's only 20 minutes. Those 2 days, the 23rd and 24th, I noticed small things. Nothing I could name clearly, just small things. When we played cards on Christmas Eve, Connor kept checking Paige's phone before handing it back to her. I thought he was looking at the time. Later I thought maybe he'd been checking her messages, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Parents can become paranoid about the people their children love. I'd read that somewhere. I reminded myself of it. On Christmas morning, Paige seemed quieter than she'd been at Thanksgiving. I asked if she slept well and she said yes, smiled quickly, looked at Connor before answering, which I also filed away as nothing. People look at their partners. That's normal. At dinner, Connor made a comment about how Paige had spent too long on the phone with her sister the night before. He said it lightly, with a smile, the way you'd say something you meant to be a joke. But Paige's fork went still for just a second. And then she laughed and said she knew, she just missed her. That fork going still? I've thought about that moment 100 times since. The morning of the 26th, I pulled my car around at 8:30. Connor loaded the bags in the trunk. Paige was quiet. I assumed tired, early morning. Nobody loves a 6 a.m. flight. We got on the highway and I had the radio on low. Some old holiday station still playing carols even after Christmas, and everything was fine for about 10 minutes. Then Paige's phone buzzed in the cuff holder between the two back seats. She reached for it, and I saw her face in the rearview mirror. Just for a second, just long enough. The color drained out of it. She read something and put the phone face down in her lap. And Connor, who was sitting right next to her, said, "Who was that?" And she said, "Nobody, my mom." And he said, "Let me see." Not a question. I watched her hand the phone to him. I watched him rate it. I watched his jaw tighten. And then the phone slid. I don't know if she fumbled it, or if he handed it back too quickly, or what happened exactly. But it slid down between the seat and the center console and landed half in the cuff holder, screen up, facing the gap between the front seats. I could see it clearly in my peripheral vision. The notification was still open. It was a text thread. I could only see a few lines from that angle, but I saw enough. "I told you not to text him when I can't see your phone. Answer me. Paggy." The contact name at the top of the thread was Connor. The timestamps showed he had sent those messages 11 minutes ago. While he was loading the trunk, while Paige and I were standing in my kitchen finishing our coffee, he had been in the driveway sending those messages, and then he got in the car and sat down next to her and asked who texted her. I gripped the steering wheel and I did not say anything. I needed to think. Here is what you need to understand about that moment. I am Connor's mother. I have loved him since before he took his first breath. I have loved him through colic and Little League and the year after Ted died, when he barely spoke to anyone. When you love someone that long and that deeply, your first instinct when someone tells you something terrible about them is to find the explanation that makes it not terrible. Maybe I misread the screen. Maybe it was a joke between them, some private shorthand I didn't understand. Maybe there was context I was missing. I spent the rest of that 20-minute drive inventing context. I carried their bags to the curb. I hugged Connor. I hugged Paige, and when I did, I held her a second longer than usual, and I said, quietly, close to her ear, "You can always call me. For any reason." She pulled back and looked at me. Her eyes were searching my face. She looked like someone trying to figure out if a door was actually unlocked or if she was imagining it. She said, "Thank you, June," and then they went inside. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for 45 minutes. Then I went inside and called my friend Wanda, who has been my best friend since 1987 and who spent 11 years married to a man who, as she puts it, treated control like a love language. I told her what I saw. I read her the messages as best I could remember them, word for word. There was a long silence. Then Wanda said, "June, you know what that is." I said, "I don't want to." She said, "I know." I want to be honest about what came next because I think it's the part nobody talks about. I didn't call Paige. I didn't confront Connor. I spent 3 days going back and forth, making arguments to myself in the middle of the night, pacing my kitchen at 2 in the morning. Every time I decided I needed to do something, I'd think about Connor's face, about Ted's eyes looking out of my son's face, about the Sunday phone calls and the Little League games and the way he'd cried at his father's funeral like a man who had not yet learned how to hold grief in his body. And I would talk myself back down. Then on the 4th day, Paige called me. She called from a number I didn't recognize, not her cell, which I'd saved. I found out later it was a phone belonging to a coworker, borrowed on a lunch break. She said hello and said her name, and then she stopped. And I could hear her breathing. And I said, "Paige, I'm glad you called." She said, "Did you at the airport? Could you see the screen?" I said, "Yes." Another long pause. Then she said, "It's been like that for about a year. I keep thinking it'll get better." I asked her if she was safe. She said yes, nothing physical, but her voice did something strange when she said it. Not lying exactly, more like answering only the question I'd technically asked. "I've thought about that too." We talked for 40 minutes. She told me things that broke my heart. Not because they were the worst things I'd ever heard, but because they were so ordinary. The way he monitored her location on his phone and asked about discrepancies if she took a different route home from work. The way he'd go cold for days if she made plans with friends without telling him first. The way she'd started mentally logging her own movements throughout the day so she'd have answers ready if he asked. She'd been doing that for so long that it had stopped feeling abnormal. She said that was the scariest part. She'd adapted so completely that she'd started to believe this was just what relationships were like. She said she loved him. She said it more than once. She said she knew that probably sounded crazy. I said it didn't sound crazy at all. I said, love doesn't stop being real just because someone is hurting you. I said that was actually part of what makes it so hard to leave. Because you're not leaving a monster. You're leaving the person you love. And the monster is just the part of them you've been trying to fix, and at some point you have to accept that fixing is not your job. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, his mother told me that. I said, I know, I'm his mother. She started crying. Not loudly, muffled like she was covering the phone. I sat in my kitchen and I listened, and I did not try to stop her because sometimes you need to let someone cry without rushing them toward being okay. When she stopped, I asked her if she had somewhere she could go. She said her sister in Cincinnati. I asked if she'd been in contact with a domestic violence resource. She hadn't. I told her about the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233. And I told her they have a chat option too if she couldn't speak freely, which she already knew but had not used because she said she kept convincing herself it didn't apply to her, that it wasn't bad enough. I said the hotline wasn't only for worst-case scenarios. I said it was for exactly this. For when you're not sure, and you're scared, and you've adapted so well you can't see the walls anymore. She asked me what I was going to say to Connor. I told her I needed to think about that. I asked her to give me a few days before she made any moves, so I could talk to him first. I wanted him to hear it from me. Not to protect him, but because I thought there was a small chance, maybe, that if it came from me, something might actually land. I'd seen it happen. Not often, but I'd seen it. We agreed to talk again in 3 days. I called Connor that Sunday. Our regular call. I let him talk first, told me about work, told me Paige's family Christmas had been nice, talked about a movie they'd watched on New Year's Eve. He sounded normal, happy even. I listened and I thought, this is the hardest part. Not the confrontation. The before the confrontation, when everything still sounds like your regular Sunday and you know that what you're about to say is going to change something permanently. I waited until he'd wound down. Then I said, Connor, I need to talk to you about something and I need you to really listen. He said okay. I said, I saw the messages on Paige's phone in the car on the way to the airport. Silence. Then, what messages? Not a question either. I said, you know which ones, the ones you sent from the driveway. Was she and I were inside? More silence. Then he said I'd misunderstood. He said they had a complicated dynamic and I was seeing something out of context. His voice had gotten careful and measured in a way that reminded me of nothing so much as myself. All those nights in my kitchen talking myself back down. The same architecture of convincing, just aimed at someone else. I said, Connor, I've been your mother for 34 years. I know when you're giving me a real answer and when you're building one. That landed. I could tell by the silence. I said, I love you. I love you the same way I loved you when you were 4 years old and told me you hadn't eaten the last of the cereal when you absolutely had. The love doesn't change. But I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw, and I'm not going to help you convince yourself it's nothing. Because it's not nothing, and you know it's not nothing. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, she never said anything to me about it, and I said, she shouldn't have to say something for it to be real. What happened after that was not a movie. There was no immediate breakdown, no tearful admission, no breakthrough in a single phone call. Connor got defensive. He pushed back. He said I was overreacting. He said Paige was sensitive, and that I only had one side. We argued, not loudly, but the kind of low, grinding argument that leaves you exhausted afterward, the kind where you can feel the other person retreating, even while they're still talking. He hung up before we were finished. First time in 8 years he'd done that on a Sunday call. I sat with that. 3 days later, he called back. He didn't apologize right away. That came later. But he called and he said, "I've been thinking about what you said." And then he said something that I have turned over in my mind many times since. I don't know when it started. I don't even know when it started. I think that was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. I told him that not knowing when it started didn't mean he couldn't figure out when to stop. I told him about a therapist in Columbus. I'd looked her up after talking to Wanda, someone who specializes in men's behavioral patterns and relationships. I told him I had already found the website and texted him the link. I said I wasn't going to make him do anything, but I needed him to understand that Paige was not safe in that relationship, and that if he loved her the way he said he did, the most honest expression of that love right now was to get help. He said he'd think about it. Paige left 2 weeks later. She stayed with her sister in Cincinnati for 3 weeks, then found a studio apartment in her own neighborhood, about 4 miles from where they'd been living together. I know this because she told me. We have kept talking. Carefully and with appropriate distance. I don't ask her about Connor, she doesn't ask me about him, but we talk. About her job, about her sister's new baby, about a pottery class she started taking on Tuesday nights. She told me once that the strangest part of leaving was how quiet it was. She'd expected to feel like she was missing something enormous, a limb or an organ. Instead, she just felt quiet. And then slowly, over a few months, she said it was like sound returning to a room you hadn't realized had gone silent. Connor did call the therapist. He's been going for several months now. We have not returned to normal Sunday calls. That's something we're both still working out. He told me once that he was angry at me for a while. I told him I understood that. He said he wasn't anymore. We're rebuilding something. I don't know yet exactly what shape it's going to take. I think about Ted sometimes, the way I always do. And I wonder what he would have said. Ted was a gentle man, the most even-tempered person I've ever known. And sometimes I think Connor's anger, that tight, controlling edge of it, is what happens when a gentleman's son learns grief too young and never quite gets the language for it. That's not an excuse. Connor would be the first to tell you that. But it's something I turn over, the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. Not to change what's there, but just to know it. I'm 63 years old. I am a retired librarian in Dayton, Ohio. I do not have a dramatic story. I have a kitchen that smells like coffee in the morning, and a car that needs new brakes, and a standing Friday phone call with Wanda and, now occasionally, a text from a young woman who once handed my son her phone in the back of my car and looked at me like she was trying to determine if the door was actually unlocked. I think about that look a lot. I hope, wherever you are reading this, that if someone in your life is behind a door like that, you try the handle. It doesn't cost you anything to try, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it turns out the door was open the whole time. I've thought about what I would have done if that phone hadn't slipped. That's the thing nobody talks about. How much of doing the right thing depends on accident. A phone sliding between 2 seats, the angle of a rear-view mirror, the fact that I happened to glance at exactly the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on how you look at it. If Connor had caught it before it fell, I would have driven home from that airport knowing nothing, and Paige would have gone on adapting, and Connor would have gone on believing that what he was doing wasn't really that serious, because nobody had ever told him otherwise. I think about cause and effect a lot now, not in any grand, cosmic sense, just the plain practical kind. The kind where your choices build a structure around other people without you realizing it, and one day you look up and the structure has become a cage, and you've been the one holding the lock. Connor didn't set out to become someone who sent threatening messages from a driveway. I genuinely believe that. But intent doesn't change impact. And the hard, unglamorous work of becoming a decent person is that you have to examine your impact even when, especially when, your impacts feel fine to you. That's the intelligence part, not book intelligence, not the kind you can test, the kind that asks you to look at your own behavior with the same critical eye you'd turn on anyone else's. Connor could not do that on his own. He needed someone to hand him a mirror. I'm not sure I was the right person to do it. I'm his mother, I love him, I am not objective and never will be. But I was the person who was there. And I think sometimes that's what courage actually is. Not fearlessness, just being the person who was there and choosing not to look away. Paige's courage looked different. Hers was quieter and cost more. She had adapted so completely to a controlled life that she'd started to read it as normal, and realizing that sitting with the full weight of that realization takes a particular kind of honesty that I think most people underestimate. It's easy to leave something you know is bad. It's much harder to leave something you've spent years convincing yourself is fine. She had to dismantle her own reasoning before she could walk out the door. That's not weakness. That's one of the harder things a person can do. I'm not the hero of the story. I want to be clear about that. I sat in my driveway for 45 minutes doing nothing. I spent 3 days talking myself in circles. I almost let it go more than once. What finally moved me wasn't bravery. It was Wanda's voice on the phone saying, "You know what that is," and the fact that I couldn't unknow it anymore. That's the thing about moral clarity. It doesn't always arrive as a lightning bolt. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet, inconvenient fact that refuses to leave the room no matter how many times you ask it to. And you can ignore it for a while, but it keeps sitting there. And eventually, if you're paying attention, you get up and do something about it. I hope Connor keeps going to therapy. I hope Paige keeps taking that pottery class on Tuesday nights. I hope somewhere out there, someone reads this and recognizes a door in their own life or in someone they love and decides to try the handle. It doesn't take a perfect person to do the right thing. It just takes someone who's paying attention.